good evening all. Thank you for joining us as we take a look at Mazda's Roadary racer that competed contemporaneously with their later 7X7 series prototypes, the RX-7 GTO. We'll actually also cover the RX-7 GTU and the origins of both cars from the road car, but I've got photos of the RX-7 GTO, so that's what becomes the subject of the video. That's how this channel works. As with most true GT racers, the RX-7 started out as a road car, with the first generation of the car replacing the rather dowdy RX-3 Coupe, which was sold as the Savannah in Japan. It served as Mazda's mid-tier performance offering below the similarly rotary-powered Cosmo Luxury Coupe. The RX-7 shared a body style with the original Cosmo, although didn't have quite the same credentials in the looks department, and by the time the RX-7 was introduced, the Cosmo, as with so many vehicles of the era from both Japan and elsewhere, had succumbed to the malaise era and lost its excellent first-generation lines. Be that as it may, the new RX-7 was offered only as a fixed-head coupe, with its Vonkel rotary power plant mounted ahead of the cabin but well inboard of the front wheels for better weight distribution. 3 engine choices were offered, all twin-rotor designs of either 12A or 13B designation, with the 12A offered either naturally aspirated or turbocharged. One could have either a 3 or 4-speed slush box or a 4 or 5-speed manual transmission, depending on if you were an individual who wanted to be miserable or who found value in their existence, respectively. Weight, depending on options, trim level, and engine, was between 2,300 and 2,500 pounds, or 1,043 to 1,134 kilos, and performance was respectable for the time, with 0 to 60 times given in the mid-8 seconds for the naturally aspirated 12A engine, and improving from there. From the start, the RX-7 was intended to go racing, and it started out well in privateer hands in IMSA competition, and managed to gain an entry to Le Mans in 1979, merely a year after the car started production. This initial outing, however, did not go well, and the car failed to qualify, only to come back the subsequent year under the aegis of a Pierre Honegger, a New Jersey-based Mazda dealer, who worked with Holman Moody of NASCAR fame to prepare the car. This effort went better, with the car placing 21st overall, which was well down the class order, but a finish at Le Mans is commendable no matter what, and, if you'll recall from the Rondeau video, as 1980 was the year of Monsieur Rondeau's great garagista triumph as the first and to date only driver-constructor to win the French endurance kerfuffle, the weather was less than kind to competitors that year. Anyway, by 1983, Mazda's Le Mans ambitions had shifted to prototypes and the Group C rule set, a project which culminated in the 787B. For more information, and if you want any information on how rotary engines work in general, I haven't covered the 787 yet. It does appear in the Return of Previous Winners video from last year's Le Mans that I published, but there is a rather extensive 767B video on the channel that touches upon the general development of their prototype efforts, as well as a few other things besides. Thus, the RX-7 continued primarily in IMSA and SCCA competition. At the time, IMSA GT racing was divided into 2 classes, GTU and GTO. GTU stood for GT Under, and was a class for more production-based cars with limited engine displacement, originally 2.5 liters and later expanded to 3 liters. GTO, on the other hand, did not stand for Grand Touring Omologato, as it does on so many vehicle badges, most notably those of Ferraris, but rather for GT Over, for any cars that displaced, you guessed it, greater than the GTU cap. The RX-7 originally competed primarily in the GTU category, as mentioned, in mostly the hands of privateers, and did so with distinction. They went 1-2 in class at the 24 Hours of Daytona, and proceeded to win the series championship in their debut year, 1979. This was the start of a monster 7-year straight championship run, with Mazda's direct involvement increasing late 1984, as they started to support highball racing for the development of an even more capable model. While previous RX-7 entries had been converted from road cars, this new GTU was in fact purpose-built from the ground up, with a custom space-framed chassis draped in bodywork approximating the look of the Gen 1 RX-7 road car. Despite the finishing touches being put on mere hours before the new car's race debut at the 1985 Daytona 24 Hours, or at least the practice sessions leading up to it, it would go on to win its class and represented a fundamental shift in the GTU class away from modified road cars, and instead following more closely the trend that was already extant in the GTO class, that of the silhouette racer. The new RX-7 GTU excelled at Daytona, but struggled elsewhere in its first 2 seasons, taking no further class wins in either year. They did update the car to reflect the launch of the second-generation RX-7 in 1987, and it saw continued success until 1990, taking 5 Daytona class wins, as well as one at Sebring and one at Riverside, which reportedly makes the highball RX-7 the most successful single chassis in IMSA history. So that's a fun fact, or factoid if it's not true. The early successes of the GTU gave Mazda the confidence needed to develop a more aggressive GTO version, this car for 1990. GTO had in many ways inherited the spirit of the All-American GT class, as essentially an unrestricted GT class as long as a few vaguely road car-shaped elements were retained, and Mazda took full advantage of this as the Decon Monza had a decade and a half before. In fact, they even brought Lee Dijkstra in to design their new beastie, so everything has really rather come full circle from that video a month and a half ago. Apart from everything in between. So full circle in a very roundabout way. The project started with Mazda's Le Mans Roadary engine that powered the late 7X7 series prototypes, the 13J. We have talked more extensively about this power plant and the elements of rotary engines in the 767B video, but as a reminder, it was Mazda's first 4-rotor Wankel, which was essentially 2 production RX-7 engines splodged together with a stretched eccentric shaft. These engines were electronically fuel-injected, and in its application in the GTO, the 13J produced even more power than it did in the 767, reportedly about 600 horsepower and 390 pound-feet of torque. This power plant sent power to the rear wheels through a Hewland 5-speed manual, and was housed in a steel tubular space frame with carbon fiber and aluminum bodywork that preserved, again, the vague shape of the RX-7 road car, although I somehow doubt that carbon composite panels were an option on the factory order sheet from the dealership. Suspension for all 4 wheels was, say it with me everybody, double wishbones with coil springs and dampers, as well as push rods in the front. Actually, that was a little bit different than usual, but you know what I mean. Braking came from ventilated discs on all 4 wheels, provided by AP. Tires were, judging by the sponsorship, from Goodyear, and all up the GTO weighed in at just over a metric ton, 1,020 kilos, or 2,250 pounds dry. 2 cars were built to run under Dick St. Ives' aegis, with the first assigned to defending GTO champion Pete Halsmer, poached from Ford Roush, and the second driven by Jim Downing, who also provided premises for the team's operations in Hotlanta and team management services. Despite a promising start at Daytona in 1990, when the car took pole position in class, the 13J's reliability, particularly for periods of extended high-rev running, was a known weak point for the car. And let's be honest, at Daytona, it's pretty much all extended high-rev running, especially around the banking. And the pole sitter was out after only 61 laps, though the other car would go on to take a second in class behind a Mercury Cougar XR7. Admittedly, it was 18 laps in arrears. By mid-season, though, the car was coming onto pace and took a trio of wins in the season at Topeka, Mid-Ohio, and San Antonio, the latter giving Halsmer the honor of earning the 100th class win for an RX-7 in IMSA competition. It was also the last win for the GTO that season, but the first year's lessons were taken to heart, and by the start of the 91 season, Downing had rotated out of the second car to focus on team management, with the back half of the 1990 season split between Elliott Forbes Robinson and Price Cobb, the latter of whom got the drive for the next year. His victory at Le Mans with Jag in 1990 certainly hadn't hurt his chances either. 1990 was nevertheless where the car really came into its own, with Halsmer and Cobb essentially running the show in GTO that year, taking 5 wins between them, as well as the GTO championship for Mazda and for Halsmer. But as is so often the way of these things, This success brought shifting priorities, and Mazda's ambitions pivoted to an IMSA GTP program for the 1992 season. The GTO RX-7s were thus mothballed and shipped home-ish to Mazda in Japan, although one was resurrected for a 1994 Le Mans entry in GTS, where it did rather well and finished second in class, but a whopping 67 laps behind the class-winning Nissan 300 ZX Turbo. In total, RX-7s in GTU and GTO took 106 class wins in IMSA competition, a record which I believe stands to this day. It's also worth noting that the RX-7 was not just a World Sports Car Championship and IMSA racer, although that is the primary focus of this channel. It also did well in Australian touring car racing after its introduction by Alan Moffat, winning the 1983 championship, 3 Bathurst podiums, and 3 endurance championships down under, and under Tom Walkinshaw's management, competing in several 24-hour races, not just Le Mans, as well as the British Touring Car Championship, to take home top honors at the Spa 24 Hours in 1981, as well as the British Touring Car Championship trophy in 1980 and 1981. The car that kindly provided photos for this video has been restored by Mazda Motorsports in the United States and is now campaigned across the country at historic events alongside a 767B, with my photos coming from last year's December Sebring event. That brings us to the end of another video, and for this week's call to action not containing the 3 sacred words of YouTube,
like, comment, subscribe.
Heck, I'm going to phone it in this week and just encourage y'all to go watch some other videos on the channel. This is somewhat remarkably video 115. Video 100, not counting a few that I've unpublished, as well as shorts. And ultimately, I think we've come a pretty good distance in the past 20 months or so. Also, being selfish here, trying to pay for my own wedding here in a month and a half, and while the AdSense money isn't much, even a single coin has music, if it be gold. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern clip. Or recommend me to others you know that might enjoy the content, or that you don't like that much if you don't enjoy the content all that much. I'm not picky. Anyway, that just leaves it for me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and to wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.